Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's just jump right in. Today, we are taking an energetic, highly structured look at one of literature's most terrifying, captivating, and, honestly, deeply misunderstood minds. We're talking about Heathcliff from Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. For literally generations, readers have been completely shocked by him. But today, we're going to put him under a modern psychological and ethical microscope to figure out what actually makes him tick.
To really understand why we need this investigation, you just have to look at how people reacted when they first met him. Back in 1848, Graham's Ladies magazine called the book a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. They literally suggested the author should have committed suicide before finishing it. I mean, wow, that is some visceral, genuine disgust right there.
And honestly, it gets better. The North American Review called Heathcliff the epitome of brutality, basically a deformed monster that even the devil himself would reject. What's really fascinating here is the sheer scale of the revulsion. It perfectly frames our central mystery for today. What kind of character, what kind of psychological profile could possibly provoke such absolute, universal outrage from the critics?
So, Section 1, A Savage Reception, The Arrival of Wuthering Heights.
Take the Examiner in 1848, for instance. They wrote that the characters were savages ruder than those who lived before the days of Homer. Now, you have to remember, the Victorian reading public, they wanted polite morality tales, right? They wanted heroes who did the right thing. Instead, they got this raw, feral protagonist who swore, abused people, and just raged across the Yorkshire moors. If you've ever read the book and felt that Heathcliff is a deeply disturbing figure, you are in excellent company. These early reviewers felt the exact same way. But, why is he like this?
Let's look at Section 2, The Psychology of Trauma, Profiling the Past.
To understand the monster, we really have to look at the child. So let's pivot from 19th century criticism to a modern psychological framework. There's this brilliant concept from a research paper out of Taylor University called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. These are childhood traumas that negatively affect biological, cognitive, and emotional development, disrupting what psychologists call identity achievement. Basically, severe early trauma breaks your ability to form a stable, healthy moral self. So the crucial point here is applying this directly to Heathcliff. Just consider this absolutely devastating list of ACEs. He was found starving and houseless in the streets of Liverpool. He suffered constant racial marginalization, getting called a gypsy brat. He endured severe emotional neglect. And once Mr. Earnshaw died, who was literally the only person who supported him, Heathcliff was subjected to relentless physical abuse and forced labor by his adoptive brother Hindley. His environment completely upended his childhood. His identity was just left floundering in trauma. But wait, trauma alone doesn't automatically create a villain, right?
Which brings us to Section 3, Pip versus Heathcliff, Diverging Paths.
To really explore this, let's look at another famous Victorian orphan that Charles Dickens gave us, Pip from Great Expectations. There is a brilliant divergence between these two. Both Pip and Heathcliff experienced severe adverse childhood experiences. They were both abused, orphaned, and poor. But Pip attained identity achievement and ultimately returned to his moral center. Heathcliff, on the other hand, failed to attain identity achievement and became a generational abuser, violently trapping the next generation in his own cycle of trauma.
Which leads us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? Why did Pip heal while Heathcliff became a monster? I really want you to think about this for a second. What is the missing piece of the psychological puzzle here?
Well, the answer is PACEs, protective and compensatory experiences. These are positive childhood experiences involving authentic relationships, safety, and mentorship that actively combat the effects of ACEs. Pip had the unconditional love and mentorship of his brother-in-law, Joe Gargery. Joe was his anchor. He spoke positively into Pip's life, teaching him gentleness and honesty, and that ultimately saved Pip's moral compass.
And this brings us to the profound tragedy of our subject today. Heathcliff's PACEs? 0. He had absolutely no moral direction, no reliable mentorship, and 0 safety. Because of this, he tethered his entire identity, his entire emotional security, to just one person, Catherine Earnshaw. She was his only lifeline. So when she grew up and chose to marry someone else for social status, Heathcliff lost his only anchor. With absolutely no PACEs to fall back on, he replaced that love with a terrifying, all-consuming obsession with revenge. So how did this lack of a stable identity actually play out in society?
Moving into Section 4, Doomed by Ethical Chaos.
Now, what's really interesting is mapping out the sheer chaos of his life using ethical literary criticism. As an adopted orphan, his identity was never recognized. He was just abused. As a brother, he shared an almost incestuous taboo with his sister named Catherine. As a lover, he was completely rejected because he didn't have the right social class. And finally, as an avenger, his obsession was entirely destructive and unsatiating. His love and his very existence were fundamentally incompatible with the ethical rules of the world around him. He was just completely lost in a massive confusion of ethical identities.
This dynamic is brilliantly illustrated between him and his only anchor. People say Catherine was the domesticated Heathcliff and Heathcliff was the undomesticated Catherine. They were essentially mental twins, completely united in their wildness on the moors. But when Catherine bowed to social ethics and married Edgar Linton, she became domesticated. Heathcliff, with his 0 paces and deep, deep aces, was left as a feral outsider, completely undomesticated, driven only by spite and a broken heart. Which begs the question, who could possibly conjure up such a terrifying, incredibly accurate psychological profile way back in 1847?
Section 5. The Mind of Emily Bronte. The Creator's Shadow.
Let's zoom out from the fictional moors to reality for a minute and trace the timeline of Emily's own trauma-touched life in Haworth, Yorkshire. In 1821, her mother dies. In 1824, she's sent off to the extremely harsh Cowan Bridge School, a place that was rampant with typhoid and severe privation. In 1825, her 2 older sisters actually die of tuberculosis. It's just devastating. So by 1831, their surviving siblings create these incredibly detailed, isolated fantasy worlds, like Gondal, literally just to cope. Her isolated, death-haunted environment birthed this legendary story.
And just consider Emily's day-to-day reality. She was raised in an area with incredibly poor sanitation and really high mortality. She was extremely solitary and fiercely independent. When she eventually went to school in Brussels, she stubbornly refused to adapt to societal norms or even Belgian fashions, and she was openly mocked by her peers for it. She was an outsider who just completely refused to conform, bonding deeply only with her sister Anne and their imaginary worlds. In a lot of ways, she shared the deep isolation and stubbornness of the very characters she created.
Consider this really powerful observation from her teacher in Brussels, Constantine Heger. He said, "She should have been a man, a great navigator. Her strong, imperious will would never have been daunted." He marveled at the brilliant, logical, and incredibly stubborn woman hiding behind the pseudonym Ellis Bell. She didn't write a polite Victorian romance because, well, she simply wasn't a polite, conforming Victorian woman. She had a fiercely independent spirit.
Which brings us to a provocative thought I want to leave you with today. Did Emily Bronte create a monster, or did she simply hold a mirror up to the devastating reality of untethered trauma? Heathcliff wasn't just some Gothic villain designed to scare readers. He was a psychological masterclass in what actually happens when a human being is entirely stripped of love, mentorship, and ethical grounding. I really hope this explainer gave you a totally new lens to view this literary classic. Go revisit the text with this framework in mind and see if you read Heathcliff the same way again. Thanks so much for learning with me today.